I think we have made enormous mistakes in our approach to the Middle East. I think that the crisis between Europe and Russia over Ukraine is partly because of a flaw in American foreign policy in handling that issue. In East Asia, I think that by and large, the foreign policy of President Obama has been sound. It's been compatible with China's continued rise. It has enabled us to cooperate on a whole range of issues. We now have military-to-military contacts that are better than any time since the 1980s. Both sides want to expand those contacts.
Ambassador Roy, some were suggesting that the Obama administration came into power regarding its policy in Asia-Pacific, particularly China, with the perception that it has been outdated, its policy. Therefore, it has to be a new one. Has there been a new one? Has the newer version, quote unquote, better than the older version?
Well, I would say our policy toward China has developed. But my recollections, and they're very clear, because I was part of a small dinner with Secretary Clinton within a month of her becoming Secretary of State in 2009, before her first trip to Asia. And we discussed China, and we discussed our relations with Asia, and it was at that dinner that she made the decision that we ought to join the East Asia Summit. And her comments about China were all positive in terms of the way we were looking. And I recall specifically that one of the goals of the Obama administration was to not make the mistakes of earlier administrations of getting off on the wrong foot with China, having tensions rise. Their deliberate approach was to try to play down bilateral issues during that first year.
But that might be 2009. But what about later? What about later?
Later?
With the pivot to Asia, rebalance in Asia, China take it very differently from what the US preached.
No. China defines the rebalance to Asia as an effort to contain and hold down China's growth. I totally disagree with that view of it. And the facts support my view in my judgment.
What are those facts you have in your mind?
$600 billion of bilateral trade.
That has always been the tradition. The bilateral trade has always been very strong.
What was the high point
of the relations?
What was our biggest strategic competitor during the Cold War? Soviet Union? What was the most trade we had with the Soviet Union? 4.5 billion. Our trade with China is over 100 times bigger than it ever was with the Soviet Union.
Will that be the fabric that's really likely to stabilizing the relationship? That's the big question mark.
I think the goal of the Obama administration was to maintain our presence in East Asia because that was necessary for a rising China to be able to continue to rise peacefully without destabilizing the region. Do Chinese think that China can become the strongest power in the region with the United States withdrawing and that all the countries around China will consider that to be a healthy situation? That would be fantasy thinking. China is faced with a security problem. It wants to be more secure, but at the same time, if it is totally secure, all of its neighbors will be insecure. The American presence enables China to be more secure without threatening the security of its neighbors.
Well, you're coming from the diplomatic circle. From the military, it might be a different story. We heard some rhetorics over there at the time.
I think both China and the United States have made a mistake by letting the military become too much of a spokesperson for our interests in the South China Sea and by emphasizing the military aspect of relationships too much. That's why I thought it was particularly important when President Xi Jinping on the White House lawn said China, with respect to the Nansha, 无意搞军事化. That was a very important statement.
Militarization.
No intention to carry out militarization of the Nansha. I happen to think that he was serious when he made that statement, and I think that both of us should be working. That's why we hope that the Philippines and China will be able to reach agreement to lower tensions, because if China and the Philippines can lower tension in the South China Sea, I think it'll be much easier to lower tensions generally and to get things back onto a diplomatic track. All the countries of Southeast Asia, including all of the claimants, and that means China too, have agreed to avoid provocative actions and to settle disputes through peaceful negotiations and consultations. The United States supports that.
The biggest danger, Ambassador Roy, is uncertainty. And we see one of the biggest uncertainties right in front of us, That is your presidential election. We do not know between the two candidates who is likely to be in the White House and what their agenda might be, whether in Asia Pacific or worldwide, particularly towards China. What do you make of the potential, Ambassador Roy, given your political wisdom and experiences?
Well, let's look at it from two standpoints. Let's assume that Hillary Clinton gets elected. In terms of her, we have to look at two things. Will she get off a good start with China, or will she have a difficult first year? My experience has been that our relationship with China is based on national interest. If we have bad relations with China, it begins to hurt us. One of the reasons is all of China's neighbors, when China does not act threateningly toward them, want to have a good relationship with China so they can enjoy the economic benefits they get from that. If we tried to gain support in East Asia for a containment policy against China, we wouldn't get it. East Asians don't want to choose between China and the United States. And my advice to Americans is don't talk leadership in East Asia. Why? Because no one expects China to follow US leadership, and nobody expects the United States to follow Chinese leadership. What the countries of East Asia want is for us to be engaged in East Asia. And that's what they're worried about now. They're worried about because Donald Trump talks as though he may walk away from our alliances. He talks about Japan and South Korea having to go nuclear so they can defend themselves. Both candidates have walked away from TPP. I think that's an enormous mistake. And I think if Hillary Clinton becomes president, one of her biggest problems is going to be trying to restore confidence that the United States is going to remain economically engaged in East Asia. So in other words, it's not going to be the security challenges, it's that issue that will become one of the first things she has to deal with. But she will also have to deal with the perception in the United States that North Korea is on a very dangerous track and may be able to threaten US security in the near future, meaning over the next 5 years, in ways that many Americans consider unacceptable.
It really depends on what kind of advisors she has.
In the case of Mrs. Clinton, I know most of the people who will be her advisors, and they are good, experienced people. That's one of the problems with Mr. Trump. If he were to become president, he has no track record.
Having said that, though, what if situation really dramatically changes? What would be the mechanism, Ambassador Roy? This is an urgent question, and it's a real question.
The mechanism
to control if there were any damage in the future.
Well, China and the United States have the best mechanisms we've ever had to deal with big problems. Our presidents meet regularly.
Right.
We have the strategic and economic dialogue. We have a military-to-military dialogue that is actually active and healthy. We now have dialogues at all sorts of levels.
That would be able to do the job, even with a new president that's thinking very differently from the previous ones.
I frankly have confidence that the leadership in China and in the United States is sufficiently intelligent to be able to manage these questions. Why? Not because they are necessarily the world's best negotiators, but because our national interests will be damaged if we let our relationship drift toward tension and rivalry.
I grew up in Chengdu,
Yes.
Sichuan province. But how much of that Chinese culture, consciously or unconsciously, have become part of you?
The nice thing about it is I avoided the problem of either demonizing the Chinese and seeing them as these strange foreigners, or romanticizing them and thinking them of these wonderfully cultured people who so and so. To me, Chinese are human beings. My closest friends as a child were my Chinese playmates. My parents' closest friends were their Chinese friends. So for me, and I had to be guarded as a child. We lived in a university area. For me, Chinese are human beings just like Americans. That is a very good thing to grow up with. I didn't have to learn to find out that Chinese are just like other people. I experienced it during my childhood. I'm comfortable in China because I've lived here all my life. And therefore, one of the marks in my judgment of a good specialist is somebody who's comfortable living in the other country. Now, you see, China does that. You send your people to the United States. The first 2 years are difficult because it's so different. But after 2 years, they become comfortable. Our people come to China for 6 months or a year. That's not long enough. They have to stay long enough so that living in China is something that they find easy. They're familiar with it. They know how to handle problems. Their language is good enough so they can deal with issues. That's the goal that we should do. Now China's ahead of us in this respect. We were ahead of China back when we established diplomatic relations because China's at that time had no opportunity to go to the United States. You've done a wonderful job over the last 40 years of developing people who have been in the United States long enough to understand us. We ought to build on that.
How would you describe the current generation of the so-called China hands? I mean, the one in their 30s and early 40s, compared to, like, just say, your generation.
It's terrific.
What is terrific? The comparison is terrific, or?
I was the last of the missionary children who grew up in China to join the U.S. diplomatic service. Then we went through a period of 20-some years, during which Americans only learned about China in Taiwan and Hong Kong, had no opportunity to go to the mainland, and Chinese had no opportunity to come to the United States. They got pretty good Chinese, but not really good Chinese. Now we have American specialists who are growing up, living in China, living in Taiwan, speaking excellent Chinese. They have a good understanding of China, and I'm delighted because it has restored people who have the exposure to China necessary to be able to deal with China from a standpoint of familiarity, and that is helpful. So I like our new rising China specialists.
If we spend our childhood in one place, we could always have flashes back about the time we spent there. What is usually the images of that flashback for you about Chengdu, about China, about your childhood?
We lived in Huaxiba in Chengdu.
In Chengdu.
And my images as a child is wearing straw sandals, just like the local boys, walking on dirt roads, playing with my Chinese playmates. The family next door to us had two children that I played with. Going to school there, going into Chengdu. We lived outside the city wall. Going into Chengdu for a Cantonese breakfast where we would eat tong yuar and things like this. These are the types of memories I have. Going out to the mountains in the summer, going to Emeishan where we lived for a month in a Buddhist temple. Going to Ya'an in the summer to escape the heat, living in a Buddhist temple. Traveling over dirt roads, having to put wooden planks across the rivers in order to cross. These are the types. Being bombed by the Japanese for 4 years. We had a dugout in the back of our house. We had to use the public dugouts. I remember the air raids, the sirens, the searchlights. Those are all some of the memories I have.
That have all become part of you, I guess.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Roy, for being with us and also sharing your stories and, of course, your insights. Thank you so much.